I, 34, never thought I would find myself in such a situation. My wife, 31, and I lived a pretty ordinary life. Work, home, maybe a movie night now and then. Like any couple, we had our ups and downs, but nothing that would raise any red flags. And looking back, I think I could have noticed something, but not from her side. It all started with my family. My parents always seemed like a solid couple. At least, that's what I thought growing up. My mom, who worked as a nurse, and my dad, an architect, seemed like they had figured out the key to a happy marriage. But then something changed between them. Mom started staying late at work more often, saying she had a lot of paperwork, extra shifts, or things like that. At first, I didn't give it much thought. She's a nurse, after all, so I figured she was just busy. But my dad started to suspect something. He tried to brush it off at first, but as her late shifts became the norm and the coldness between them grew, it became clear that something was wrong. Dad tried to talk to her, but it didn't lead to anything. Mom would just brush it off or change the subject. The atmosphere at home became unbearably awkward. Eventually, after a year of these suspicions, Dad found out that Mom was cheating on him with a colleague. And what's worse, she didn't even deny it. She just said she didn't love him anymore and that their relationship wasn't working. Hearing that felt like watching a train wreck in slow motion. My parents, who had been together for almost 30 years, became enemies. They started fighting over the house and everything else. Mom didn't even want to move out, despite being the one who cheated. She didn't care. She just kept living there like nothing had happened while Dad packed up his things. Dad couldn't stay in the same house as her. He was devastated. And of course, I couldn't just leave him like that. I offered to let him stay with me and my wife until things settled down. My wife, being the caring person she is, agreed without hesitation. We figured he needed time and space to heal, and our house would be the perfect place for him to clear his head. But then things started to take a turn for the worse. At first, everything seemed fine. Dad kept to himself mostly, spent time with us, but stayed quiet for the most part. He and my wife got along well. She was sympathetic, always making sure he was comfortable, helping him with meals, and talking to him about what he was going through. Honestly, I appreciated how much she stepped up. She seemed to understand that he needed someone to talk to, especially when I was busy or at work. But slowly, I started noticing some strange things. At first, I didn't pay much attention to them. My wife started texting my dad a lot, more than seemed necessary. She'd invite him to run errands with her, things I normally would have been asked to do. They'd go for walks and talk late into the evening while I was upstairs working or watching TV. I told myself it was all harmless, that they were just bonding over the shared trauma of my parents' divorce. But one day, I came home early from work because I had forgotten some important documents for a meeting. I didn't tell my wife I was coming back because, well, why would I? I figured I'd just grab the papers and head back. But when I pulled into the driveway, I saw my dad's car. It wasn't unusual. He was living with us. But something about the situation made me stop and think for a second. I tried to shake off the feeling and went inside. The house was unusually quiet. There was no TV or talking, so I assumed they had gone out. But then I walked down the hallway, heading towards the kitchen where I'd left the documents, and I heard them. Their voices were enough to make me pause, but it wasn't anything specific. They were just laughing about something trivial while drinking tea. They even offered me some tea, inviting me to join the conversation, but I told them I was too busy and just came to grab the documents. I left the house and headed back to work, thinking I was being paranoid for no reason. But, as it turned out, I wasn't. I created this account just for this story because I still can't believe I'm writing it. I desperately need your opinion. After that strange moment with my dad and my wife laughing over tea, everything went on as usual. I tried to forget about it and convince myself that it was just my paranoia, although something still bothered me deep inside. But I had work to focus on, and life doesn't slow down to let you dwell on uncomfortable feelings. As we approached my wife's birthday, we decided to do something more fun this year. Instead of the usual family dinner, we thought, why not throw a real party at our place? Invite friends, have some drinks, put on some music. It seemed like a great way to break out of the routine. I won't lie, most of the preparation for the party fell on my wife and my dad. He was already retired, so he had a lot of free time. And with my busy work schedule, I couldn't help out as much as I wanted. Back then, it didn't seem strange. I thought they were just doing something nice to make the party a success. But looking back now, I see that's when everything started to become clearer. The day of the party finally arrived. I was running late at work, as usual, and rushing to make it to the event. On my way home, I stopped by a local flower shop, which was just about to close. I wanted to pick out the most beautiful bouquet for my wife to make the evening even more special. While I was choosing the flowers, my dad called. I should mention that by the time he called, he was already drinking. I could hear the sounds of the party in the background. Music, laughter, people talking. He was slurring his words a bit, and I found it hard to understand what he was saying. But then I heard him thank me for letting him stay at my place and saying how great the party was. I was confused. It's just a party. Why was he thanking me again? I brushed it off and said I was glad he was having a good time, but I couldn't talk because I was in a hurry to get home. Then he said something that made my heart stop. His exact words were, "Forgive me, son, but your wife, she's just amazing." I froze. I remember standing there, surrounded by flowers, and it felt like the world started spinning. My dad had never said anything like that before. What did he mean? The way he said it, like he was apologizing, sent chills down my spine. I immediately hung up the phone, forgetting about the flowers. I rushed out of the shop and drove home, all the while replaying his words in my head, trying to make sense of them. By the time I got home, it was late, and the party was in full swing. People were drinking, laughing, music was playing. It seemed like everyone was having a great time, but my mind was focused on one thing. I started looking for my wife or my dad, but neither of them were there. I felt my stomach drop. I knew something was wrong. My dad's drunken words echoed in my mind. Ignoring the congratulations or greetings from the guests, I walked through the house and headed toward the bedroom. I didn't know what to expect, but deep down, I already had a feeling of what I was about to see. When I opened the door to our bedroom, my worst fears were confirmed. There, on our bed, were my wife and my father. They were together, tangled up like a couple of teenagers. They didn't even notice me at first. It wasn't until I stood frozen in the doorway, silently staring in disbelief, that they realized I was there. Both of them were drunk, and when they saw me, they scrambled to cover themselves, stuttering apologies and trying to explain, but I couldn't hear any of it. In my head, everything was drowned out by a deafening silence. I turned around and left. I didn't say a word. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just walked out. I went through the living room, past the guests who were still enjoying the party, and out the front door. No one stopped me. No one asked where I was going. It seemed like no one even noticed. I drove around the city for hours, trying to process what I had just seen. My wife, my father, together. How do you even begin to make sense of something like that? How can you go back to a normal life after something like this? I kept replaying it in my head, hoping that maybe I misunderstood something, but deep down I knew. It was exactly what it looked like. The truth was right in front of me, and I couldn't unsee it. I didn't go back home that night. I just couldn't. Instead, I checked into a hotel, trying to figure out what to do next. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them again, in our bed, as if nothing else mattered. It wasn't just a betrayal by my wife, but by my own father. I had taken him in when he had nowhere else to go, and this is how he repaid me. Since then, I've still been in this hotel, trying to figure out what to do next. In one night, I lost two of the closest people to me. And the worst part is, I don't know what to do now. Should I confront them? Just walk away and start over? How do I even look my father in the eye after all this? How do I begin to accept that my wife, the woman I loved and trusted, did this? If anyone has been through something like this, I desperately need advice. What would you do in my place? Thanks for the support and advice. It helped a lot. Here is the continuation. I should probably mention something here. In the moment when I had walked into that room earlier that night, I didn't just freeze and leave without doing anything. Before walking out, I snapped a picture. I didn't even think about it at the time. It was just pure reflex. I guess some part of me knew I'd need proof, or maybe I wanted them to feel the humiliation they deserved. Whatever the reason, that photo was now burning a hole in my phone, and I couldn't get it out of my head. I thought about revenge, about making them feel the same kind of pain they had caused me. The idea took root in my mind, and I started to plan. I knew exactly what I had to do. Around midnight, I drove back to the house. The party was still going strong. Music blasting, guests laughing, drinks flowing. It was like nothing had changed, like the world had moved on without me, even though my entire life had just been shattered. And there they were, my wife and my father, still having fun, acting like everything was perfectly normal. That made me feel sick to my core. How could they carry on like this after what they'd done? The house was dimly lit, the perfect cover. No one noticed me slipping in, and I took a moment to observe the scene. My wife, laughing with some friends, holding a drink, pretending that nothing was wrong. My father, talking with a group of guests, looking as comfortable as ever. They had no idea what was coming. I walked over to the speaker and hit pause, shutting off the music. The room went silent, and heads turned toward me, confused. The dim light flickered as I flipped the switch, bathing the room in brightness. All eyes were on me now, people wondering where I'd been all night, why I hadn't been enjoying the party. Everyone stared, but I didn't feel nervous or ashamed. I was angry, furious, and that anger was the only thing holding me together. In the sudden quiet, I could feel the tension building as I stood there. Then, I took a deep breath and apologized for interrupting. "I'm sorry for the disruption," I said, voice steady but cold. "But I think it's time for some honesty tonight." You could hear a pin drop. People exchanged glances, unsure of what was happening. My wife, still standing there with a drink in hand, looked confused but hadn't caught on yet. My father sat down on the couch, his drunken smile fading into uncertainty. That's when I pulled out my phone. Without saying a word, I opened the photo I had taken earlier. The image of my wife and father, together in our bed, filled the screen. I raised the phone for everyone to see, turning it toward the guests. Gasps filled the room. I watched as faces twisted in shock and disbelief. No one said a word. I didn't need to explain, but I did it anyway. "This," I said, my voice louder now, cutting through the silence, "is what I walked in on earlier tonight. While you all were out here celebrating, having fun, my wife was upstairs in bed with my father." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to go off. Everyone was frozen, staring at the photo, at me, at my wife. I looked over at her. The color had drained from her face, her mouth slightly open, eyes wide in disbelief. She dropped her drink, glass shattering on the floor. Tears started streaming down her face as she stood there, completely exposed. My father, though, didn't say a word. He just sat there on the couch, head down, shoulders slumped, knowing there was no defense for what he had done. He didn't even try to argue, didn't try to make excuses. He just sat in silence, fully aware that this was the moment his betrayal had come to light in front of everyone. The room was dead silent for a moment longer, as everyone processed what I just told them. Some of the guests looked horrified, others uncomfortable, like they didn't know where to look. It felt like time had stopped, and I could hear my heart pounding in my chest. I looked at everyone, then back at my wife. She was sobbing now, trying to speak, trying to explain or apologize, but I didn't want to hear it. There was nothing she could say that would make this right. "I hope you all enjoyed the party," I said finally, my voice bitter. "But for me, the party's over. Goodbye." With that, I turned around and walked out the door, leaving the wreckage behind. The last thing I saw was my wife collapsing onto the couch, head in her hands, and my father still sitting there, motionless, as if the reality of what he'd done was finally sinking in. But I wasn't going back to the hotel. I couldn't. I needed someone to talk to, someone who wasn't part of this nightmare. I drove to a colleague's house, not a close friend, but someone I trusted enough to talk to. He was surprised to see me at his door in the middle of the night, but he let me in without asking too many questions. We sat down with a bottle of whiskey, and I told him everything. I poured out my soul that night, telling him about the betrayal, the pain, and the complete destruction of my family in a single evening. He listened without judgment, offering the kind of quiet support that I desperately needed. He didn't try to fix it or tell me what to do. He just let me talk, let me process. We spent the rest of the night in silence, broken only by the occasional clink of glasses as we took another drink. I didn't feel better, not really. But for the first time since the betrayal, I didn't feel completely alone. After that long, painful night with my colleague, I woke up the next morning feeling a bit more clear-headed but still deeply shaken. I thanked him for letting me crash at his place and for the support he gave me. There wasn't much more to say, so I gathered myself, got in the car, and drove back home. When I walked through the door, both my wife and my father were there, waiting for me. It looked like they had been up all night, judging by the bags under their eyes. They stood in silence for a moment, maybe expecting me to say something, but I didn't have any words left. They started apologizing, both stumbling over their excuses, telling me how sorry they were, how it was a mistake, how it would never happen again. The whole scene was pathetic, honestly. I was numb to it all at that point. Their words meant nothing to me. I just couldn't take it anymore. I didn't want to hear their apologies or see their faces ever again. So, without any dramatic speeches, I told them to leave. They needed to pack up and get out of my house. There was no way they were staying under my roof after what they had done. My wife started crying again, but I didn't care. My father just stood there, defeated. They both knew they had no leg to stand on. Once they were gone, I sat down, staring at the empty space they'd left behind. Part of me still couldn't believe it had come to this. I never imagined that I'd be kicking my own father and wife out of my home, but here we were. This wasn't some nightmare I could wake up from. This was real life. As I later found out, they had nowhere to go. They couldn't turn to my mother, and none of their friends were willing to take them in after what had come to light. So, they ended up living in a hostel, of all places. The irony wasn't lost on me. They betrayed me and destroyed our family, and now they were living in the most pitiful circumstances possible. But even that wasn't enough for me. I wasn't done with them yet. I was still seething with anger, and I knew exactly how to get back at them. My father was in the middle of a legal battle with my mother over their house. Even though my father had been cheated on first, he still had a decent chance of winning the case and keeping the house for himself. But after what he'd done, I had no loyalty to him. I wasn't going to just sit back and let him keep what little dignity he had left. Now, here's where it gets complicated. My relationship with my mother wasn't exactly on great terms either. She had cheated on my father, which is what led to their divorce in the first place. She was no saint, and I had every reason to distance myself from her too. But the way I saw it, if my father could betray me the way he did, then he was no better than her. So, in my mind, he didn't deserve to win that case. I decided to help my mother win the court battle over the house, not because I cared about her, but because I wanted to ruin him, the security my father had left. I threw myself into the legal process, working alongside my mother's lawyers, digging up whatever I could to strengthen her case. I didn't want to admit it, but I was fueled by pure spite. It wasn't about justice or fairness. It was about revenge. My mother could sense it too. She knew I wasn't doing this out of love or forgiveness. She didn't ask questions, though. She just took the help and ran with it. The court battle dragged on for a few months, but with my help, my mother finally came out on top. The judge ruled in her favor, and my father lost his claim to the house. It was a devastating blow for him. He had no property, no stability, and no family left to turn to. My wife, who had stood by him during the case, was now stuck in the same sinking ship. The two of them had nowhere to go. No home, no money, no future. I had effectively destroyed their lives. And you know what? At the time, I was satisfied with it. I felt like I'd won. I had taken everything from them the same way they had taken everything from me. It was petty, it was vindictive, and it was ugly. But I didn't care. Revenge was the only thing driving me forward in those days, and I followed through on it to the very end. Now, fast forward to the present. It's been a while since all of this went down. My father and ex-wife are still out there somewhere, trying to scrape by. I don't know where they live, and honestly, I don't care. They're nothing to me now. I haven't spoken to either of them since that night. As for me, well, my career has soared to new heights. I've poured everything into my work, and it's paid off. My standard of living has gone up dramatically. I have money, I have status, I have everything I could ever want in that regard. From the outside, you'd probably think I'm doing great. But here's the thing. Despite all the success, despite having the revenge I thought I wanted, I'm still alone. My father's betrayal and my wife's infidelity left scars that I don't think will ever fully heal. I've cut off ties with most of my family, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust anyone again. Sure, I've got a great career, but when I come home at night, it's to an empty house. There's no one waiting for me, no one to share my success or my life with. Looking back, I'm not proud of what I did. Yes, I got my revenge. Yes, I tore down their lives just like they tore down mine. But what did it really get me? I'm still left picking up the pieces of my own shattered life, and no amount of money or career success is going to change that. So here I am, telling you my story. I don't know if I made the right choices. I don't know if there was ever a right choice in a situation like this. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that revenge, no matter how sweet it feels in the moment, doesn't fix the pain underneath. It doesn't rebuild what was lost. And now, I'm left wondering, where do I go from here?